Thank you for joining us for a discussion on national security challenges in the 21st century with Vincent Rigby, National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. My name is Aaron Shull, and I'm the Managing Director and General Counsel of CIGI. It is a pleasure to have you with us. With COVID-19, we have seen cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns launched by adversarial state actors, the domestic deployment of the Canadian military along with other national forces to protect vulnerable populations, the disruption and vulnerability of just-in-time global supply chains, worrying domestic political tensions and fractures in many states, and an erosion of international cooperation. All of this is taking place on top of tectonic geopolitical shifts, bookended by climate change and a much overdue discussion about data, tracking, commercial surveillance, and the attention economy. A long overdue reappraisal of Canadian strategic approaches to national security will have to emerge in the post-COVID-19 environment. We need new strategic thinking and must overcome a tendency to do siloed assessments and policy frameworks. Those days are over. As I've said previously, foreign policy, domestic innovation, intellectual property, national prosperity, data governance, cybersecurity, and trade are now all inextricably linked. Adversarial states now seek advantage across these areas, treating them as strategically connected, and we have to do the same. This is why CIGI recently launched a major new project aimed at reimagining a Canadian national security strategy for the 21st century. It'll consider a range of both traditional and non-traditional threats, the relationships between them, as well as the ways that Canada can influence global policy and rulemaking to better protect future prosperity and enhance domestic security. It's in this context that I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Vincent Rigby. In January 2020, Vincent Rigby became National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. Prior to this appointment, Vincent served as the Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2019 to 2020, Associate Deputy Minister of Public Safety from 2017 to 2019, Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy at Global Affairs Canada from 2013 to 2017. We are so pleased to have you join us, Vincent, for this important forum for a sophisticated discourse on national security issues. As a procedural matter, this video will be recorded and posted at cgionline.org for future viewing. And please do use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen to ask questions anytime throughout the discussion, and we will do our best to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. Again, Vincent, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm looking forward to having, as sophisticated as I can make it, discussion with you today. Before I get started with my formal remarks, I did, however, just want to say a few words about the very tragic events that have happened in London over the last couple of days, London, Ontario. We learned yesterday, I think as we all know around Canada, that a family of 5 was targeted in a truly horrific attack based on their Islamic faith. 4 people lost their lives, and a 9-year-old child remains in hospital. I would like to express my deepest condolences to the family and the loved ones of the victims. There is no place for terrorism, intolerance, hate, and Islamophobia in this country, and you would have seen remarks very similar to what I've just said by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons earlier today. Thank you again, Aaron, for this opportunity to speak to you today. And I have to say, I'm very pleased to be here. The preparation of the speech has given me an opportunity to reconnect with CIGI, and this is an organization that has over the years become very close to my heart. I was a board member at CIGI for a couple of years, and my experience then was that this organization does some truly great work. So it comes as no surprise that is continuing with your current project in the national security space. So kudos to CIGI and its partners in undertaking this project, which is a truly important one. As many others have said, including a couple of my colleagues before CIGI recently, I too believe we need to elevate the national security and intelligence dialogue in this country. By that, I mean not only talking about national security, but doing so in an informed way and paving the way for concrete action. And not just when things go wrong, but also on an ongoing basis. Opportunities like this one that are public and include civil society are part of what's needed to help make that happen. So with this in mind, I'd like to make a few key points today. First, as every national security and intelligence advisor sees his or her role slightly differently, I'd like to begin with a few comments on my position. Perhaps not everybody knows what the average day of an NSAA looks like. Probably more than a few of you don't even know what an NSAA is. So let me give you just a little bit of context. Second, I'll offer my reflections on the current moment we find ourselves in globally and some of the national security challenges Canada is facing. Third, I'll describe some of the current tools that Canada has in its possession to confront these challenges. And finally, I'll offer some points for consideration on where Canada can go from here, with perhaps a few lessons from our friends and our allies. My bottom line is this: the world is at an inflection point. It is experiencing seismic political and economic shifts and facing a complex combination of new and enduring national security challenges. And as COVID-19 has made painfully clear, these challenges are relevant to all Canadians in their daily lives. So this environment requires a new, I would argue, broader definition of national security, and it requires Canada to be prepared and to step up its game. National security threats against Canada, whether from state or non-state actors or from global phenomena such as pandemics and climate change, are greater than ever and directly impact our economy, our democratic institutions, and our way of life. In the face of such massive change, Canada's national security and intelligence community needs to evolve and it needs to adapt. That means ensuring our authorities and tools are fit for purpose, increasing transparency with Canadians, furthering diversity and inclusion initiatives, refining our governance structures potentially, and working across and beyond government. Indeed, we need a comprehensive response that is not just whole of government, but that is truly whole of Canada at the end of the day. But we need to start by engaging Canadians in an open and continuous dialogue about national security. So let's get to it. First, what does an NSAA actually do? Well, as the title implies, I provide policy and operational advice as well as intelligence to the Prime Minister and Cabinet on issues related to national security. I meet with the Prime Minister, his office, and ministers on a regular basis to help shape the government's national security agenda and respond to emerging issues, everything from domestic terrorist incidents like we've seen over the last couple of days to international security issues. In addition, from my position at the Privy Council office, I convene and help coordinate the security and intelligence community. I'm not the boss of the deputy ministers in this community. If anything, they're probably mine in all likelihood, but my role is to help ensure we work to the greatest possible extent as one integrated team. Now, this team includes the traditional players in the S&I community, the CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSE, the Communications Security Establishment, Public Safety, Global Affairs Canada, the RCMP, CBSA, the Department of National Defence, the Canadian Armed Forces. But beyond that core group, there are a growing number of departments and agencies with a direct nexus to national security, including Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, Agriculture Canada, Health Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and so on. It's a large community, though not nearly as large as that in the United States, of course. And given the dynamic and global nature of national security challenges that we continually face, it can involve virtually every single department across Ottawa on any given day. One of the most important aspects of coordinating this community is to ensure that decision makers have the information they need to prevent and respond to threats to Canada and to Canadian interests. And this is what brings me to the I in NSAA, intelligence. The case for intelligence, in my view, has never been stronger. Timely, relevant intelligence assessment with a nexus to Canadian interests helps us understand the world and the threats we face. It helps inform policy and operational decision making. As such, continuing to push intelligence out to a broader community of consumers and up to senior officials and politicians has been one of my major priorities over the last 18 months on the job. Finally, a big part of my job involves liaising regularly with partners outside of the so-called Ottawa bubble. And it can be a bubble at times, I can assure you. This includes my international counterparts, especially in the Five Eyes, with NATO allies, and with like-minded partners. The NSAA works on international security issues, often as much as domestic ones. So maintaining these relationships is absolutely critical. It also includes working with key stakeholders from other levels of government, provinces, territories, municipalities, as well as academia and the private sector. And as I'll come back to later, national security is not just a challenge for the federal government, it is a responsibility for us all. So, you know a little bit more about what I do. Let me now offer some reflections on the current global landscape and what implications we can draw for Canada's national security. It's become somewhat of a cliche in recent years, and I know you've heard it before, but that doesn't make it any less true. We live in an increasingly complex and dangerous world, and I'd say in 2021, this is truer than ever. Canada, like many of our allies, is confronted by a myriad of emerging and cross-cutting trends and threats. Traditional, enduring threats have not gone away, but they are taking on new dimensions while at the same time intersecting with non-traditional ones. So to this end, I'd like to highlight three key trends that are dominating, in my view, the national security landscape at this moment. First, heightened geopolitical competition characterized by an increasingly multipolar world. Second, rapid technological change, something that I know is very close to CIGI's heart. And finally, the accelerating impact of transnational security challenges such as climate change and global health issues. And this is where the expanded definition of national security truly kicks in. So the first trend is the emergence of a more multipolar system. Changes in global economic development are shifting the international balance of power, particularly towards the south and to the east. For example, the Indo-Pacific is an increasingly important center of global growth, home to 3 of the world's top 5 economies, the largest trade pact, and 5 of the most populous countries. That said, the defining element of this multipolar shift is the rise of China. Beijing's political, economic, military, and technological ascendance has been the key development of the last 3 decades and will continue to be a significant international force in the years to come. China has become much more assertive in its region and internationally. It has expanded its power and influence, including with the Belt and Road Initiative, and has also attempted to undermine states it perceives as competitors. To that end, the People's Republic of China represents a key strategic threat to Canada. As Public Safety Minister Bill Blair noted last year in a letter to members of Parliament, China, and also Russia, is particularly active in Canada when it comes to foreign interference. As the minister stated, foreign interference by Canada threatens, and I quote, the integrity of our political system, democratic institutions, social cohesion, academic freedom, economy, and long-term prosperity, as well as our fundamental rights and freedoms. China leverages a well-integrated economic, military, and diplomatic toolkit, as well as human and cyber-enabled espionage to achieve its objectives. And I'd add to that list arbitrary detention, covert diplomacy, as we've seen with the 2 Michaels. At the same time, Russia remains determined to play a disruptive role internationally. This includes in its immediate region, such as continued occupation of Crimea. It is also reflected in its international efforts to undermine democratic elections and spread dis and misinformation online. Indeed, China and Russia and other hostile state actors will continue to pose a significant security and economic threat to Canada through their foreign interference, disinformation, espionage, and hostile cyber efforts. This activity poses a direct threat not only to the government, to government institutions, but also to individuals, to businesses, to universities, to research institutions. So this shifting global environment in which political, military, and economic power is more distributed and contested than ever will see regional powers try to revise the status quo in their spheres of influence and beyond. Many parts of the world are already fraught with instability and are potential flashpoints for conflict. In the Indo-Pacific, we have tension in the South and East China Seas, over Taiwan and Hong Kong, on the Korean Peninsula, and along the border between India and Pakistan. In the Middle East, there's the continued threat from Iran, the civil war in Syria, and the recent violence in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. In Africa, conflict in the Tigray region in Ethiopia persists, while violent extremists in Mali, Burkina Faso, and increasingly Niger continue to extend their reach in the Sahel region. In Latin America, Venezuela continues to be caught in a downward economic and political spiral. And this is far from an exhaustive list, but it is illustrative of the complex global situation that we find ourselves in right now. And I mention these flashpoints to make the point that the seeds of national security threats are often sown beyond our borders, whether from state or from non-state actors. And as a country which benefits from collective security, Canada has a strong interest in preserving the stability of the rules-based international system. And this interest takes on new urgency as we try to work within a multilateral governance system that is struggling under the weight of 21st century problems in politics. Now, in this multipolar world with many potential flashpoints, we're also seeing a renewed contest of ideologies, one that is pitting liberal democracy against autocracy and is leading to the further erosion of that rules-based international order. Liberal democracy is increasingly being supplanted by authoritarian governments who seek to weaken multilateralism, principles of individual freedoms, the rule of law, open trade, and human rights. This directly threatens Western interests. In 2021, Freedom House reported its widest annual gap between gains and losses in democracy since 2006. Today, only 1 person in 5 lives in a free country. This playbook of today's autocrats has also evolved with access to novel technology to enable their activities, including the repression of political opponents and the dissemination of disinformation and propaganda, both at home for them, but also overseas. And Canada is not immune from any of these nefarious activities. This brings me to the second trend, the idea of technology and technological competition, which is which is what I'd really like to highlight now. Technological advances have been and will continue to be transformative across all aspects of our society. Emerging technologies have the potential to improve Canadians' lives and create opportunities for our industries. We all know that. But they also, rising geopolitical competition, is driving a science and technology contest between states, which puts Canadian researchers and innovators, both in the private and the public sector, in the crosshairs. The speed of change will also exacerbate the vulnerabilities we face from threat actors the speed of change will also exacerbate the vulnerabilities we face from threat actors if we are not ready to respond. The objective for democracies is to keep a comparative advantage, as competitor states will use their technological and economic edge as levers against us. Here in Canada, for example, we have observed the strategic investment in sensitive sectors by companies who obfuscate their state ties. We've also seen the theft of intellectual property to advance the interests of foreign states and state-backed companies at the expense of the legitimate owners of that technology in Canada's long-term economic security and its prosperity. And it seems not a day goes by without a devastating story about the impact of cyber attacks or ransomware. Looking to the future, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing will deepen threats to our national security posed by hostile states, by criminals, and by others. This includes leveraging advanced computing to enable irresponsible cyber activity and the use of AI to support sophisticated disinformation campaigns. It'll go beyond these threats. New technologies will change how national security is conducted in the future, but exactly how, we just don't know for sure at this point in time. What we do know, and as Shelley Bruce, chief of CSE, noted in her remarks to CIGI last month, is that irresponsible cyber activity undermines the stability and the predictability of cyberspace. Canada must be ready to respond. And at the same time, we must actively participate in domestic and international discussions defining the norms, the technical standards, and acceptable behavior in cyberspace. And it's in this context that non-traditional challenges to national security, such as health security and climate change, act as accelerators to many of these trends. Global health security will continue to be a key concern beyond the current pandemic. Changes in human activity, including urbanization, mass displacement, and migration, coupled with the effects of climate change, will create conditions for the emergence and spread of new diseases. We've already seen the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in the daily toll of cases and lives lost. And we are starting to see the secondary impacts. The pandemic will continue to affect global economic growth and lead to increased poverty and potentially social unrest. The pandemic has also provided threat actors with more opportunities to conduct irresponsible activity online. This includes the leveraging of social media by violent extremists, the exploitation of cyber tools for reconnaissance and for espionage, and efforts by states to spread, again, disinformation. Compounding the consequences of the pandemic are the effects of climate change on human security. Climate change will place more strain on communities worldwide. The World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, climate change could cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, illness, and heat stress. Here in Canada, past and future warming is on average about double the magnitude of global warming. A warmer climate will intensify weather extremes, meaning more severe heat waves and increased drought, wildfire, and urban flood risk. This will stress our critical infrastructure and our emergency responders. Climate change will, of course, also lead to major changes in our Arctic, as it already is. As Canadian areas of the Arctic and Atlantic Ocean experience longer and more widespread ice-free conditions, threats to our sovereignty and security will increase and already are. Reduced ice cover will fuel competition over navigable waterways, discoverable energy, and mineral resources. It'll also have a military and espionage dimension, especially in relation to Russia and China, which are investing in their Arctic capabilities. Now, in addition to health security and climate change, terrorism, violent extremism remained an enduring concern. The pandemic has provided extremists from across the ideological spectrum with opportunities to generate even more hateful propaganda and conspiracy theories. Ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE, in particular, poses a growing threat to Canadian national security and is our most deadly extremist threat. And sadly, we've seen this play out in recent days. In response, earlier this year, the Government of Canada placed 4 additional IMVE groups on the criminal code list of terrorist entities, including Atomwaffen Division, the Base, the Proud Boys, and the Russian Imperial Movement. In this space, we have also observed notable cases of threats and intimidation directed at Canadian politicians and officials, and of course, vulnerable groups. At the same time, foreign-based terrorist groups such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda have not disappeared and remain the most dangerous foreign terrorist organizations. Though diminished, they both maintain global networks and the intent and the ambition to strike Western interests. So we cannot turn a blind eye to these groups either. In addition to all these threats that I've talked about, transnational organized crime is an enduring concern. Transnational organized crime groups distort the global economy, undermine democratic institutions and the rule of law, and enable corruption, notably through money laundering practices. And as the ongoing Cullen Commission in British Columbia brings home to Canada, that review has shown the challenges of combating transnational criminal networks. So I'll take a deep breath. That's a pretty gloomy picture. And with everyone sufficiently depressed, perhaps I'll just stop right here. I'm kidding, of course. But I went into some detail here, if not at great length, because I wanted to drive home this point. We do live in a turbulent, in a competitive, and a dangerous world that we need to be prepared for. So now what? How can Canada best position itself to advance its national security interests, defined in the broadest sense? To start with, we need to leverage and improve all of our tools, from diplomacy and international assistance to our military and intelligence assets, both at home and abroad. We need both of those games at home and abroad. Diplomatically, Global Affairs Canada can continue to harness the expertise of our Foreign Service to further Canada's interests abroad. Global Affairs promotes international peace and security through a variety of activities, including such areas as women, peace and security, non-proliferation, arms control, international cyber policy, international crime, and space. And it's a much longer list than that. Canada's launch earlier this year of the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations is a great example of the importance of diplomatic tools in upholding human rights and supporting the rules-based international order. Sanctions and attribution statements are traditional tools in our diplomatic toolkit. Canada's international assistance efforts will also help promote security and stability abroad by improving economic, social, and political development in recipient countries. Without these investments, instability can thrive and lead to national security threats to our own country. Militarily, the Canadian Armed Forces must defend Canada's interests in a shifting security environment in which geography no longer affords us the protection it once did, and it hasn't for quite a while, quite frankly. In the Arctic, for example, the military enforces our sovereignty and security through increased surveillance and control of Canadian territory in the face of increasing threats. Our military also works closely with our allies and partners abroad to support peace and security in such places essential in South America, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific. And then there are our core security intelligence agencies, CSIS, CSC, RCMP, DND, and Global Affairs Canada. They must also work day in, day out to gather intelligence, investigate and respond to threats to the security of Canada, ensure our critical cyber systems, and keep Canadians safe. These agencies have a number of tools at their disposal. For example, CSIS collects human intelligence and leverages its threat reduction measures. CSC can collect signals intelligence and launch active or defensive cyber operations. And the RCMP can conduct criminal national security investigations. From a whole of government perspective, the National Security Review under the Investment Canada Act is a great example of a horizontal tool. Depending on the foreign investment under review, the process engages the expertise of departments and agencies ranging from finance to the Public Health Agency of Canada to Natural Resources Canada. This reflects the diverse threat landscape and various avenues sophisticated threat actors use to advance their own interests at the expense of Canada's national security. And beyond the federal government, provinces and territories and increasingly municipalities are integral partners who are often on the front lines in our efforts to counter threats to our national security. That's our businesses, academia, and civil society. There have been several recent initiatives to further these partnerships. CSIS and public safety engage more regularly than ever with academic institutions. In March, ISED published a research security policy statement calling attention to the threat of espionage and foreign interference activities directed at Canada's research community. Public Safety's Economic Security Task Force is leading a policy review examining what additional measures, if any, are needed to ensure our continued ability to respond to economic-based threats to national security. Public consultations are going to be integral to this review. So clearly, we have a very diverse toolbox to respond to this challenging world, one that leverages both government and non-government assets. But how can we do better? How can we use these tools to maximum effect? Our allies may provide some clues. The United Kingdom's recently concluded integrated review of security, defense, development, and foreign policy is a useful model to consider when defining our strategy. What is notable about the integrated review is precisely its integrated or joined up nature across government. It brings together national security and international policy. It establishes a clear connection between the UK's domestic and foreign objectives, and it looks beyond so-called traditional national security issues, covering a broad range of policy areas. Australia, for its part, has taken steps to strengthen its national security tools in response to hostile activities by state actors. For example, in 2018, it appointed its first national counter-foreign interference coordinator to coordinate a whole-of-government response to acts of foreign interference. It also beefed up its rules around foreign investment. The government now has a wider suite of authorities to impose conditions or block foreign investment on national security grounds. Finally, the United States recently released interim national security strategic guidance that sets out a vision for how it will engage with the world and provides direction to its national security departments and agencies to help counter threats at home. So again, the away and the home game. The U.S. intelligence community also published a report in May providing a strategic assessment of domestic terrorism as a prelude to a government response strategy. With all this in mind, I believe that Canada needs to continue to keep pace with our allies in responding to the dizzying array of national security threats facing us. And we can do this in a few important ways. First, we need to ensure our policies and strategies are fully integrated and coordinated to deal with today's national security challenges. As Aaron said at the outset, we can't work in silos anymore. We can't work according to outdated definitions of national security, and we can't separate the domestic from the international. Everyone in government has a stake in national security, and future national security strategies will need to reflect this reality. Second, our core security and intelligence agencies need to adapt to complex changes in the threat landscape, including advances in technology, in order to fulfill their mandates and meet the expectations of Canadians encountering hostile activities by state and by non-state actors. I fully support efforts to ensure that our agencies' legislative authorities and tools are up to date and effective, including the position advanced by Director David Vigneault concerning CSIS in his CIGI speech earlier this year. This work should not be once in a generation or even once every 5 years. We need to continually assess our ability to deliver on our mandate as part of an ongoing and substantive conversation with Canadians and devote the necessary resources. At the same time, we need to maintain public confidence in our national security institutions and uphold the privacy rights of Canadians. Canadians have the right to have their privacy interests protected when we protect national security. This is not a zero-sum equation. As such, the third thing we need to do is increase public transparency to ensure we have the support and that we have the trust of Canadians. Significant work has been done recently to be more public about our activities and how we do our business. My speech today, and those of my colleagues from CSC and CSIS earlier this year, are an example of that. I would think the last few months have probably been unprecedented in the SNI community for CSIS, CSC, and the National Security Intelligence Advisor to speak out on national security issues. But there's much, much more to be done. This includes increasing transparency about our intelligence priorities, for example, which is something that we're considering, and about how we govern ourselves and how we work together, not just within individual departments, but across government, how we actually bring our assets together to support Canadians. While we within the security intelligence community must show our leadership in this effort, our review bodies, the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, otherwise known as NSAA, the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, otherwise known as NSICOP, the Intelligence Commissioner, they're also very, very critical here. Review is an essential part of maturing our national security intelligence culture and making sure that we actually do better. We must also learn from our experiences and demonstrate to Canadians our commitment to carrying out our activities in a manner that respects Canada's values of accountability, of transparency, and the rule of law. Fourth, we need to invest in our workforce. This includes ensuring it reflects the diversity of Canadians by hiring individuals of different racial, ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. Diversity truly is one of our greatest strengths in the SNI community. A national security community which lacks a diversity of individuals, perspectives, or experiences is one that looks too narrowly at the world, it looks too narrowly at the threats facing us, and too narrowly at how we actually have to respond to those threats. We must, for example, avoid unconscious bias at all costs. And I believe these efforts are critical and that we have much, much more to do in that regard. Fifth, we need to ensure we have the right governance structures in place to discuss national security on an ongoing basis and take action where needed. This requires taking a close look at our existing national security bodies to ensure there are no gaps, but again, that they are fit for purpose and that they have the right membership. As just one example, Canada is the only country in the Five Eyes, and the G7 for that matter, without a National Security Council type body. Indeed, our partners are actually broadening and strengthening their cabinet-level national security bodies. For example, the United States has expanded its NSC to include the Office of Science and Technology, and the administration of the U.S. Agency for International Development, indicating a broader appreciation of national security. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we need to increase our collaboration with partners, both domestically and internationally. I've already mentioned the importance of our allies, whether Five Eyes, NATO, G7. We, of course, had the G7 summit this week. We need to face national security threats together in such a complex threat environment, whether it's collecting intelligence, sharing information, or responding to specific events in a collaborative fashion. And at home, as I mentioned earlier, provinces, territories, municipalities, the private sector, and academia are in the trenches on a lot of national security issues. For example, as noted in the government's research security policy statement I mentioned earlier, Canadian research is increasingly targeted by espionage and foreign interference. We can't do our jobs without these partners. We need to get better at sharing information, providing guidance where required, and leveraging their expertise, because we can help them, they can help us as government officials. We need to evolve our approach to these complex issues in partnership with all of Canadian society. This requires leadership and engagement with you, with civil society, researchers, academics, our world-leading tech companies, and with all Canadians across the board. And these are conversations I welcome, and I look forward to continuing. So I'm going to conclude, and I hope my main message just hit home. National security is important, both for government and for all Canadians. It protects our physical security, our prosperity, our values, our democratic institutions. The world is undergoing great change, and Canada's security and intelligence community needs to evolve and needs to adapt to this new landscape. If we don't, we run the risk of undermining our national security by failing to counter threats from state, non-state actors, and from global trends such as climate change and global pandemics. To that end, we need to continue to advance on a number of fronts. We need to ensure our authorities and tools are adequate to address the threats we face. We need to increase our transparency with Canadians. We need to make diversity and inclusion a priority in our workplace. We need to look at how we govern ourselves. And most important of all, we need to work in a fully integrated fashion across and beyond government and make national security a truly whole of Canada endeavor. If we do this, we will be ready for the national security challenges of the 21st century. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and to your questions.
Thank you very much for that, Vincent. Those were insightful remarks, and I really do appreciate many of the points that you raised. I've got a few questions that I wanted to ask you, and then we'll turn to the questions from the audience. But as you were talking, I wanted to pick up on one thread, and this is the kind of broad notion of technological change, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. The world around us is changing, but the National Security Advisor position was kind of created in 2003 or augmented in 2003, but it remains little known to Canadians. Can you actually talk to us a little bit about how you've seen that role evolve? Because 2003 was a world ago, and obviously the world has shifted. So I would wonder if I could get your thoughts on that point.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Aaron. The position of the National Security Advisor came out of the last national security policy we had about 15, 16 years ago. So I think it was at 2004, 2005. We'd had a security intelligence coordinator within PCO. That's sort of the deputy secretary level, but the actual moniker, the title of National Security Advisor only popped up around 2005. What's interesting in terms of how it's evolved, the first two NSAs were actually double-hatted, believe it or not. So they were not only the National Security Advisor, they're also deputy clerk of the Privy Council. So the deputy clerk job is a pretty busy job, I have to say, and the National Security Advisor job is a pretty busy job. So how they did it, I don't know. And in fact, I was speaking to one of them, Marie-Lucie Morin, just a couple of months ago, and we were kidding each other about how the job has evolved a little bit. And she was telling me that she could do two jobs at once, and I've only got one set of responsibilities. But I have to tell you, one set of responsibilities is more than enough in this area. It only became fully dedicated, the position, to national security. Actually, it was my brother, Stephen Rigby, who came into the job, I think around 2009, 2010. And since then, I think it has evolved in some interesting ways. I think some of the governance has evolved, which I think has been good. So committees, and I know when people outside that Ottawa bubble hear committees, oh God, more government committees, but these are actually, the governance is critical to making the job work. And so being able to call people together as the coordinator of the community is really critical, and having forums fora to do that. So the creation of a committee like DMOC, which is the Deputy Minister's Operations Committee, which I chair and meets every week and deals with operational front of mind issues, and core members of the community and some of the sort of second layer of the community as well meet on a regular basis. We've created just in the last year a DMIC, a Deputy Minister's Intelligence Committee, which I chair, which brings together strategic intelligence, tactical, operational intelligence, and talks about the so what of intelligence. So it's not just a matter of producing intelligence, but what are you going to actually do with it? Let's make sure our intelligence is as actionable as it possibly can be. We've also seen the creation of bodies like the IRG or the IRG, which is the Incident Response Group. It's chaired by the Prime Minister. I'm the secretary to that group. It doesn't meet regularly, but it meets in response to specific events or crises, whether it was the shooting down of PS-752, the Ukrainian airliner, or the pandemic in its early days. That group is there as well. So that governance piece has evolved. I think the role of intelligence has evolved with the job. Hence the title is actually new, NSAA. It was just NSA, sorry, for the longest time, but they added the intelligence component, the I, just in the last few years. Intelligence was always there as part of the job. I'm not suggesting for a second that it's new, but it is something that I think the last couple of NSIAs, including me, have put more emphasis on than ever. And I talked before about pushing intelligence up and out because we're trying to expand that definition of national security, because there are so many other departments that are engaged in national security issues. The demand for intelligence is immense, and the consumers at the political level, at the departmental level, is really quite something. So my role as NSIA, I brief the Prime Minister on a regular basis on intelligence issues, but I now also brief cabinet committees on a regular basis. I brief ministers on a regular basis on intelligence issues, often with my colleagues. So the role has expanded a little bit in that regard. But at the same time, the fundamentals are still there. I support the Prime Minister. I try to coordinate the community. I try to liaise with the other players outside of government. And those challenges are still there too, in terms of my role. The role still does not have any legislative basis. I can convene people because I'm the NSIA and I work at Privy Council office, but if someone doesn't want to come to a meeting, I can't force them. And so I try to bring together people by cajoling them a little bit sometimes, sunshine policy as much as possible. And that opportunity to share information, to generate a dialogue, and to coordinate action. Challenge is still there, but I think we're doing not too badly overall. I'll stop that. I could talk quite a bit about the roles and responsibilities. That's probably enough for now.
Oh, thank you for that, Vincent. I appreciate what you said. And I wanted to come back. You talked about one of your predecessors, and I wanted to pick up on that thread. One of your predecessors actually was testifying before a Senate committee, and when they were there, they were asked what kept them up at night. So, and I don't want to make light of it, but how's your sleep these days? Kind of what's on your mind? What's keeping you awake in your role?
My wife tells me I'm a great sleeper, so that's probably not a bad thing in this job. At home, I don't sleep on the job, I promise. What keeps me up at night? I know you don't mean it literally, but what concerns me? I think it's a little bit along the lines of what I said in my prepared remarks, Aaron. It's just the sheer range and complexity of the issues that we face these days. I came into the job in January of last year, expecting to deal with a fairly normal, quote unquote, range of national security issues. And of course, we got hit with COVID-19. We got hit with PS-752. And just, looking at that threat landscape that I've just described to you, the domestic, the international, so much that's out there, just being able to stay on top of it all and to have the tools and the assets and the resources to be able to respond to them in a coordinated way. And so, I believe we've got a tremendously professional, dedicated, talented security intelligence community, but there's so much coming at us. And as we expand that definition and we try even harder to connect the dots, it is something that I think about and worry about a lot, and I know my colleagues do across the community. I mean, the other thing when you go to bed at night, that you think about. It's the black swans. It's what have we not thought about, or what are we not expecting, or what are we not even expecting that specific night. And I've gotten in the habit over the last year and a half of putting my cell phone right on the bedside table, because you never know when you're going to get that call. I've been lucky, but I have been woken up in the middle of the night a few times over the last year and a half, and having to respond very, very quickly to incidents in Canada or internationally, to call a DMOC, a Deputy Minister's Operations Committee, or some subset of the committee at 3 a.m. to try and respond to things. Those things literally keep me up at night. And we do that in the service of Canada and the service of Canadians. But you're always wondering, is the next event something you have no idea what's around the corner? Like, it's something that is going to be a complete and utter surprise. So the black swans, the stuff, as the clerk often sends to me, the stuff that goes bump in the night in your world, those always make me give me pause for thought, for sure.
Yeah, the Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
I wanted to circle back to this idea of kind of statutory authority, and obviously your role is in coordinating federal security and intelligence community, but with no statutory authority. So I would imagine that can be challenging. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the obstacles associated with coordinating the national security and intelligence community in the absence of those statutory authorities.
So I've touched upon that a little bit already, perhaps in the first question that I answered, just in terms of, no, there's no statutory authority. I'm not anybody's boss. I can't bend anybody's arm and force them to come to a meeting. But I think over time, 15, 20 years, the position of the National Security Advisor and the position of the National Security Intelligence Advisor has evolved into that moniker. It's gathered the respect of the community. I think that the community sees the utility of having a National Security Intelligence Advisor, the importance, and I think that increasingly my colleagues look to me to pull the community together and really convene and to work together to share information, to respond at the end of the day. So yes, there are challenges. As I say, I sometimes can fall back on my position at the Privy Council office. The PCO traditionally is the great convener. If PCO calls a meeting, usually, not always, usually people come to it. And when the NSAA calls a meeting, most deputies show up or send a high level delegate. But I think and occasionally you can invoke the name of the PM, and you do that very carefully, and you make sure you're on solid ground. The PM thinks this or the PM thinks that. That usually gets people's attention. But again, you use that judiciously. But it's, again, I think how you overcome the challenges is by building relationships. And I work a lot on that, regular bilats, talking to people every single day, so that when something goes bump in the night, you're not introducing yourself for the first time to somebody. So those relationships, having those governance bodies that we can get together and we can share information, so there are never any surprises. That ability just to foster a dialogue, to communicate with one another. And one of the things that we do, and I've just instituted in the last year in the Deputy Minister's Oversight Committee, is that I've mandated that 4 times a year we will exercise. And I don't mean running around the table and breaking out in a sweat. We conduct tabletop exercises, and the idea here is to really exercise the memory muscle, so that when bad things happen, you can actually respond very quickly in a coordinated fashion. So there are little tricks and tools that we've developed over the years, so that the NSAA, I think, without having solid authorities based in legislation, I think over time, I mean, almost like the Crown prerogative, there's a reputation there. There's an expectation now almost that the NSAA will call meetings, and I think I'm pretty good at being preemptive and calling meetings, but I often get a call from a deputy and go, will you please convene this meeting as soon as possible? It happened today, actually. And so there's a certain amount of respect, and it's not for me necessarily as an individual, although I hope I have the respect of my colleagues. It's respect for the position and how it's built up over the last 15, 20 years or so.
For sure, and it probably helps that there's been a run of really good people in the role. And I don't want this to come across as flattery, because it's not intended that way. It's intended as an observation from an independent third party. But you've done a really good job in the role, so I think there's something to be said for that ability to convene people based on mutual trust and respect. We promised to go to the floor for questions, and so I want to make good on that promise. And there's quite a bit of activity coming in, so I'm going to switch over to the questions from the floor now, Vincent, and I'm just going to read this one out loud. Do you think that increased transparency and, moreover, the roles of NISRA, so the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, and NSICOP, or National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, will have a chilling effect on the work of government agencies and departments in national security and intelligence? So I think you started to touch on this, but is that review going to have a chilling effect, or do you see it evolving differently?
So I'm a big fan of the review agencies. And I think early on, 3-4 years ago, I think that there was a bit of a period where I think we were just getting to know each other. So whether it was NSICOP or more recently NSIRA, the establishment of the Intelligence Commissioner, I think for a lot of agencies outside of CSIS and CSC, they'd never been reviewed, or they never had oversight bodies before. So there was a little bit of, what's this? And how do we react to this? And we're so busy. You're asking us to provide tons and tons of documents and show up to NSICOP, for example, appearances, and this is time consuming and it's labor intensive. So I think that, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but there was a little bit of that, I would suggest, a number of years ago. I have found since I've gotten into the job that, and I'm not taking the credit, but I just think through conversation and through hard work with the review bodies, that we've gotten into a different space. And that space is that the review bodies are there to help us. And I mean, they're about accountability, they're about transparency. But above all, for me, and I think for many of my deputy colleagues, I don't want to speak for them individually, but it's about making ourselves better. And I think I mentioned that in my prepared remarks. We want to get better. And so that's what review bodies do. As the chair of NSICOP has said to me on numerous occasions, and I'm not telling tales out of school because I know he said it publicly as well, that NSICOP is not in the world of gotcha. Like, we want to expose you for your errors. We are genuinely trying to improve you as an organization. And that's the way I take it. And that's the way I think increasingly my colleagues are taking it. And so a chilling effect, yeah, a little bit maybe. I don't know if I would use that word. I've said a couple of times to my colleagues and to NSICOP and CIRA members and chairs that there was maybe some teething problems early on as we got to know each other a little bit. And as I say, outside of CSIS and CSC, who've been reviewed for years and years and years, agencies and departments and deputies getting used to be reviewed. But I feel like we're over that now. And we're hitting our stride in terms of how we work with one another, how we provide information, how we remain genuine to the act on the NSICOP side, for example. I'm not suggesting it's all peaches and cream all the time. I think there has to be, in some respects, a bit of a dialectic with the bodies, and there has to be a little bit of pushback at times, and that's how you get to a good place. And so you still have that tension, but I'd like to say it's a healthier tension now. But accountability, transparency. I like the fact that NSICOP in particular, I have to say their reports have been quite impressive. A lot of you, I'm sure, would have seen the recent threat report that came out. You would have seen the report on foreign interference, on diversity. They do some great work. And the fact that they're getting out that work publicly, obviously with redactions that we work with them on, but they're getting that information out publicly. It's all part, as far as I'm concerned, of really trying to tell our story to Canadians, what we do and the areas where we can do better. And it's that do better part in particular I want us to get better collectively. I truly do. So I think that's where the review bodies are particularly useful.
No, and that really resonates with me, and it goes back to, I think, one of the theses in your remarks, which is that national security is a team sport, and they've obviously got a different role on the team, but nevertheless, it's an extremely important one, and it feels like everyone's driving at the same strategic end. So if everyone has the same strategic goal in mind, notwithstanding differences in roles, and I think it can make for a much better approach. So thank you for that. The next question coming in, given the size of the federal bureaucracy, how can government departments and agencies dismantle silos to better incorporate holistic thinking around national security?
So that's a great question, and it's something that I and my deputy colleagues think about every single day. And so it starts with culture, I think, to be honest with you, and it's just a way of thinking. And so as an S&I community, I think you've got to get it in your DNA that when something happens, you don't look inwardly, you actually look outwardly, and you reach out and you think of, okay, who is this? If this is a specific event or a specific initiative or a specific strategy that you're working on, who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to reach out to? And when I entered government many years ago, almost 30, there was very little interdepartmental work. And when I would draft a memorandum to cabinet or draft a speech, I wouldn't share it to anybody outside my department at the National Defense at the time. And now I don't think anything is done without sharing and coordinating. I shared this speech with practically every single one of my deputy colleagues. And that's the way it should be, and it becomes second nature. So I think it's about it's culture, and that has to build up over time, and not just within that core S&I community, but outside of that community as well, to some of our consumers of intelligence in particular. I think that's extremely important. We have to be inclusive, and so not just in terms of reaching out, but pulling others in. And so that's why I talked at some length about governance and why these bodies, both at the political and at the non-political level, are so important. And if you don't just create bodies for the sake of creating bodies. And I know that oftentimes when we get into conversations of governance in government, we go, oh God, not another committee, not another body, please. And I'm not a big fan of creating new bodies either. I think the bodies we've got right now are pretty damn good. And I mentioned a few of them. The Deputy Minister's Operations Committee, the DM Intelligence Committee, we have DMNS, the DM National Security Committee. These are bodies that are becoming more and more inclusive. And if you were to look at the membership now versus the membership 5 or 10 years ago, you'd be shocked. You will see at the DM National Security Committee, you will see Health Canada. I think PHAC is a member of DMNS. Natural Resources. It's an inclusive body. So I think that helps. And I think ultimately those integrated strategies that I talked about, I really do like that UK model, what the UK has done. We did that 15 years ago. We tried to, and I was still at the Department of National Defense at the time. I actually was one of the pens on the D&D strategy, but we also had a foreign policy review. We had a international assistance review, and it was tough. It was really tough work, and it didn't survive very long because we changed governments. But I look now what the UK has done, and they've taken it even a step further and much more integrated, and bringing those various objectives and bringing the domestic and the international together, and a commitment to implement. I've had a lot of conversations with my UK colleagues, not just about what they did, but how they did it. And it's instructive. It's absolutely instructive in terms of looking how they did that. And that's something that it's something to think about for sure.
Thank you for that, Vincent. And I tend to agree with the idea of a joined-up approach. I've been arguing for kind of a holistic approach to anybody who would listen for a little while now. So I really do appreciate your perspective on that. We've got another question coming in, and we maybe have time for one or two more. And this question goes to international capacity. So, does Canada need to build capacity to operate more independently? Have international alliances weakened? So it's a bit of a two-parter. So one is, do we need to build additional capacity? And this is obviously in the context of international alliances.
I talked a little bit about the importance of our allies, and I think especially in the S&I world and in the intelligence world in particular, where we are net consumers, we take a lot more than we give. It's not that we're laggards, far from it. Our intelligence community is first rate, but in terms of volume, we can't compete with the US or even the UK. So being able to act independently in an S&I context, there aren't going to be a lot of occasions when that's necessarily going to happen. I'm not going to say it's never going to happen, and we have intel, as Shelley or David will tell you, that is produced solely for Canadian eyes. But we rely on our allies. We rely Five Eyes. We rely on NATO. So that's the S&I component. I mean, on the military side, again, I don't think we act independently all that often. And I guess I'd have to see for the individual ask the question what their definition of independent is. But for Canada to truly act independently on the global stage as a military actor is not going to happen very, very often. So do we need, as I said before, for all of the different components of our domestic or national strategies when it comes to national security, we have to have the resources, we have to have the assets, we have to have the tools. Defense did a defense review a few years ago. Strong, can't remember the title of it. I should, because my wife worked on it and often talks about it. But a great review, and I think that the government provided resources as well. There's still some more work to be done, I think, especially on the North American continent with respect to NORAD modernization and some other things related to that. But Canada as an independent military actor with more kit, more assets, I think that would be a discussion that would be an interesting discussion. But I just don't see us operating in a significant way independently on the world stage from a military perspective and in terms of deploying military assets. There will always be exceptions, but I think if you were to go back over the last 10, 15, 20 years in terms of when Canada's deployed military assets, it's almost always been in an allied or a coalition context.
Thank you, Vincent. We really only have a minute left, so we should probably move to wrap up. And it was actually the strong, secure, and engaged defense policy. And a shout out to our colleagues. I'm going to hear it from my
wife now.
Yeah, I bet you will. And a shout out to our colleagues who wrote it. One of the best definitions of hybrid conflict and gray zone conflict that I've ever read was actually in that document. So good work there. Well, thank you so much, Vincent. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you for this fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and it was good to see you again, and thank you again for your service on CIGI's board of directors. I hope you've enjoyed this event. If you would like to watch it again or share it with your colleagues, we will be posting it to CIGI's YouTube channel shortly. Please subscribe to CIGI Online on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn to keep up to date on all of our upcoming events and publications. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for this event today. And thank you again to Vincent Rigby and his colleagues in the Privy Council office for everything that they do in the service of Canada and in the service of Canadians. We really appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day and stay safe.